So, welcome to this class on neuroscience of human movement. So, this will be an overview class on the motor control system, just to provide a review of what has been discussed previously and what will be discussed in future. So, we get a better idea of where we are, what our position is, because we are at a crucial stage where we have come about 30-40% in the syllabus, and we need to move forward. So, it's worth reviewing. So, in today's class we will talk about neural centers responsible for movements, the most important centers responsible for movements, and the contributions of cortical areas for voluntary movement control. So, the discussion is expected to be slightly more philosophical than the rest of the course, for example. So, let us remind ourselves of the situation. What is the situation? The situation is the following. We are interested in studying movements, purposive or otherwise, movements made by humans. And how are these movements caused? We said that these movements are caused by skeletal muscles. We described the mechanism of how to do that, how the skeletal muscles perform that, how the skeletal muscles themselves are activated. So, excitation, contraction, coupling, the sliding filament theory, etc., that we discussed. But how is the muscle fiber itself getting activated? We said that is done through alpha motor neurons. We said that is like when we discussed the mechanism of how alpha motor neurons communicate with the muscle fibers. We discussed the case of the neuromuscular junction, right. So, these motor neuronal pools, where are they located? Let us remember that they are located in the spinal cord. Actually, this entire dashed box that is shown here represents spinal cord, right. So, the alpha motor neurons are in the spinal cord, and there are local circuit neurons that control this the alpha motor neurons, and these local circuit neurons also receive information that is sensory in nature. So, this is afferent information, is it not? And we said this is the efferent information. We said where these are located, the dorsal and the ventral roots per se, and we discussed in the previous classes these details, right. And let us remember, this sensory information did not necessarily come only from the central sources such as vision, audition, etc., but also important sensory information come from the periphery. This is proprioception. We discuss how that information is coming. The function of muscle spindles, the function of Golgi tendon organs, discuss the case of the cutaneous receptors and all those things, right. This information somehow modulates the local neuronal circuits, which further through some processing, minimal or otherwise, some processing control the motor neuronal pool and its excitability. Okay. Importantly, that it is worth noting that the alpha motor neuronal pools do not receive information from the higher centers directly. This is not happening. Okay. What is happening is this, right. Information from the motor cortex and brain stem goes to spinal cord, and it is the spinal cord that communicates with the alpha motor neuronal pool and further causes movement. We discussed this while discussing the case of size principle. We said that motor cortex or the brain cannot decide which particular muscles or motor units to recruit, right. The brain cannot decide which particular motor units to recruit. It can only decide other things, but not which specific ones to do this. This we discussed during the discussion on size principle. Okay. Importantly, information from as in the sensory information from the spinal cord reaches to two places. We discussed these two cases also. One is this pathway, that is the spinocerebellar pathway. Okay. Through this pathway, information reaches the cerebellum and it is processed somehow, and it also goes to the somatosensory cortex, right. Information reaches to the somatosensory cortex, and through association cortices it indirectly contributes to the control of movement via the motor cortex and the brainstem. I said that an area located just anterior to the central sulcus is responsible for the control of movements, and we call this area as the primary motor cortex, right. So, this is the primary motor cortex or M1. That means, whenever I say primary, there is supplementary and there are also pre-motor cortices. So, their functions will be discussed in future classes. So, what we have learnt so far is at the peripheral level the function of muscles, the function of motor neurons, the function in the spinal cord, the function of sensory information in modulating movements in that are through the spinal processes, and all these things through reflexes, through oligosynaptic or polysynaptic reflexes, not necessarily monosynaptic. All these things we have discussed so far. We have to discuss the important or the crucial role of the primary motor cortex. This needs to be discussed in future classes. So, that will form our discussion for the next 1 or 2 weeks approximately. So, primary motor cortex and brainstem areas in controlling movements. And it turns out that basal ganglia also contribute to movement. These are said their purpose hypothesized to be playing a crucial role in movement selection. A hot area of research, still these things get keep getting updated. Cerebellum in error correction, short term and long term both, or in other words adaptations and motor learning. So, these things also we need to learn. So, we will spend some time, substantial amount of time discussing the crucial role of basal ganglia in movement selection, and what could happen if the basal ganglia is somehow affected, or its performance or its normal function is somehow compromised. Same with cerebellum, we will discuss the crucial role of cerebellum in movement control and its contribution to learning, and what could happen if that is compromised, right. So, what we will be focusing on will be this box, as in the primary motor cortex, basal ganglia, cerebellum. What we will not be focusing on are these, the somatosensory cortex and the association cortices we will not be focusing on. What we have already done are these, whatever is in the dotted box, as the spinal systems and the spinal processes we have already done. So, this is the status of the course as of now. So, we have so we will be focusing first on the primary motor cortex in the next few classes, followed by basal ganglia, followed by cerebellum. Or we should also discuss what is not mentioned here, we should also discuss the role of the premotor areas. Now, these play a crucial role in combining information from association cortices and making. This is where the difference between the cognitive and motor part starts to blur. The details we will discuss also. So, this is also something that we need to discuss. Role, how does the cortical area play a role in control of voluntary movement? First of all, I could have a causal relationship between the stimulus and the response through these arrows. Actually, there is more to that than the simple system that represents, but let us discuss this anyway. Now, let us suppose that I decide to pick a ball, or a person decides to pick an object that is here. Now, we have to see how that is going to be executed. By the way, there need not be a stimulus for making a movement. By the way, this is an object that I have to pick up. So, that means there is a stimulus, right. But there can be no stimulus, yet some intention to perform a movement. So, I may decide, I may have an intention to take a walk or not, as the case may be. So, there is an intention. So, there is an internal decision that is made, or there is I may respond to the environmental activity. So, there may be something that is happening, I may choose to respond to that, that is response to a stimulus, or I may make the decision internally. So, that is an intention based movement. So, both can happen. And so in the simple case of stimulus driven movements, so there is a stimulus and there is a system that makes a unified consistent representation of the world somehow. So, this may be called as a model, this may be called as a, so at least we have some idea of what this stimulus represents. So, it is consistent with what we know as the physical world. It cannot be, for example, some illusion, right. By the way, there are some illusion cases of illusions also which we are not considering, a simple case that is not an illusion, right. So, then there is a mental makeup of what is going on, or a model, or some representation of that stimulus is made by a perception system, right. This perception system then leads to a decision to act. Should we decide to act? By the way, let us also note that the decision to not act is by itself a decision. I could choose to not act, there is a stimulus that is coming, I could choose to keep quiet, or I could respond. I could respond in a number of ways. If I choose to not act, by the way, that is a decision that is made, that is probably performed by a cognitive part of the brain, right. And then this information, this decision that has been made must be communicated to the part that is going to execute the action, right, which by itself is can and will be more complicated, that I will discuss next, and which will lead to a response. Now, let us remember that this represents a very simplistic scheme of what could happen. This has some value in understanding things from a neuropsychological or a cognitive psychology perspective, right. However, its value stops the moment you get into the details. So, in this kind of science, it is the details that matter. So, we need to be cautious in interpreting data or making decisions based on simplistic models, but that does not mean that this model has no value, there is some value in this. Also note, each of these boxes such as perception, cognition, action could involve its own serial processes. For example, if we have an intention to make a movement or a stimulus that is driving a movement, suppose I have to pick up the object, suppose I want to pick up, suppose this object is there on the table, I want to pick up the object. Now, I have to make a decision about what will be the movement that will be required in the external world, right. So, this is sometimes imprecisely called as extrinsic kinematics. So, what that means is that the endpoint kinematics, for example, approximately I think that is what is meant here. So, I want to know what is the movement I will be making in the external world, but note the movement that my body will have to make need not be so simplistic, because my body has its own constraints. So, if I have to make that movement in the external world, what kind of relative movements do my body parts have to undergo? That is the question. So, in other words, the external movements are actually made possible through movements of or relative movements of body parts with respect to each other, is it not? This is what we have been saying from the beginning. So, that means what joint rotations do I have to make, how, by what angle? Maybe it is not so, it is not micromanaged to that level, or maybe it is, we do not know, we will have to discuss that in future classes. At least we need to know which joints to activate, at least it is clear that there must be some idea of if I want to pick up the object with the right hand, it is right hand that I must be moving, not my right leg. At least that is, at least to some extent it is clear that there must be some decisions that must be made this. So, that if I have to move my right hand, what is the joint angle that I will have to make with each of the joints that are involved. So, this is represented by the intrinsic kinematics, right. Then this leads to the muscle activation in the kinetics. So, muscle activation is done through, it is not so direct as if there is a line, there is probably more to that, right. So, muscle activation that are responsible, that will generate the required forces that will make the joint angle that is required. This leads to the response. Actually, this gives an impression that what, this is a strictly serial organization, one follows another, or so it seems, right. Actually, this is not true, it is not that these elements that are presented here are strictly serial, but rather can be can happen simultaneously. Evidence for that claim comes from neurophysiological studies. Okay. So, this model comes from a psychology background, whereas the current evidence from physiology or neurophysiology data tells us that this model is too simplistic to represent what is actually, to capture what is actually going on. Okay. So, the details are missing, but still this has some value, we will have to review what value that this has and appreciate it for what it is worth. Okay. So, what have we learnt in today's class? So, we have learnt what are the neural centers responsible for movement, we have asserted what we have learnt so far and what we will be learning. We will be looking at primary motor cortex, premotor cortex and cerebellum and basal ganglia in the future classes. We will not be looking at association cortices and supplementary motor area, we have already learnt the spinal processes, right. And we have seen how cortical areas could contribute to the voluntary control of movement. This could be at multiple levels, this could be at the perceptual level, this could be at the cognitive level, this could be at the motor control level, this could be at the level of transformation of an extrinsic kinematic to an intrinsic kinematics. So, what I have to do in the outside, right, to achieve what I have to do in the outside world, what are the internal movements that I have to make, what are the movements that my body have to make, right, that transformation. Actually, there are multiple transformations that need to be made. If that movement by the body has to be made, what are the muscles that need to be activated and in which sequence, what is the time course of action and all those things. So, the details are important in this kind of thing. So, this is what we have learnt in this class, and in future classes from next class onwards we will start with a discussion of primary motor cortex. We will start with an historical account of what is going on. So, with this we come to the end of this class. Thank you very much.